So, an example of fettering discretion and, an example of why you shouldn't fetter your discretion. So, a case which I had involved an elderly lady who was living in a 1950s touring caravan. She was a travelling show person, so these are the people who set up fairgrounds to tour the country. And you see themselves as a distinctly separate group of people from Romany or other travellers. They have a number of sites which they stay in for up to half of the year, and then the other half of the year they're touring around, typically during the summer, putting on the various rides and games of chance that you see at traditional events for fairgrounds. So she was retired, she was in her 90s, and she lived with her 70-year-old son. And the caravan which they'd been living in, they'd had for nearly 50 years. And it was in a very poor condition indeed. It had a heater in it, but the heater had stopped working. They had a gas stove which they used to cook on, but aside from a little portable halogen electric heater that they had, that was about the only thing that they had in the way of provisions within the caravan. So it was very cold, very humid in there when the heater was running. Very little space in there, and they didn't have any, they had running water to the sink, but they didn't have any toilet facilities. And so in the 90s, the woman in question had to be assisted by a 70-year-old son in order to move out to a small shed around the back of where she was situated, across some rough ground. In order to go to the toilet in a bucket which was stored in the shed, and this happened at all seasons. The woman in question could be put into bricks and mortar because she was a travelling show person, and so her identity was and herself was very much tied up with the existence within the caravan. And so one of the restrictions on powers to give assistance is that it's mostly based around the requirement to provide adaptations and alterations to physical properties, concrete or bricks and mortar buildings, and permanent structures. And he wasn't allowed to use that assistance to provide works for temporary structures such as a caravan. So we had to, if we fettered our discretion, we just walked away and said, no, we can't do anything. And so the woman would continued in that situation, and there weren't really any other sources of assistance for her. So we ended up applying for a special permission off of the head of our section in order to take one of the grant pots that we usually used for home improvement in order to get rid of the old caravan and purchase a new caravan. So this was the 1990s, or late 1980s holiday caravan, which had all of the facilities on board and an awful lot more space. The local Showman's Guild, we made a number of meetings with them and worked with the site owners in order to get a site license put in place in order to improve the levels of basic amenities that were shown on the site. Because at the time, the site was surprisingly still unlicensed, and we had to have a license for these caravan sites. Interestingly, it didn't even have planning permission to be used as a site, and so we had to ensure that it got retrospective planning approval because it had just always been used that way. So we had to get the owners to obtain what's called a certificate of lawful use. That meant that it had permission to use the site as a caravan site, which then meant that we could get a license for the owner, so you could give a license to the owners of the site, and that had various stipulations in amongst the conditions of the license to provide minimum levels of things like sanitation and fire safety. The sanitation is especially necessary because the bucket in question, which the elderly lady and her son had been using to use the loo, was emptied into a manhole cover about 50 metres away at the bottom of the site, and someone had welded a handle to it. And so they needed some proper sanitation facilities. So the Showman's Guild representatives there were very welcoming and worked with us, and they provided lorries and cranes in order to manoeuvre the new unit into the site and then to dispose of the old unit. Because they tended to look after their own, and this was someone who was a retired member of their community. They also provided some useful advice and guidance for us based on what was going on in other licensed sites as to what we could put as license conditions on the site. So the grant funding paid for the purchase of a much warmer, heated caravan with adequate water supply and sanitation. The local Age Concern charity and the council's Gypsy and Travellers representative came in on the case, and together they managed to provide a package of assistance in order to look after the two occupiers of the caravan after we as Environmental Health had finished our involvement. And so they looked at doing things like putting a skirt around the bottom of the caravan, which is typically just wooden planking, but does a lot to prevent wind from running underneath the caravan, which then makes it much colder in winter. They were also able to pick up issues such as getting the electric hooked up and maintenance issues which were required within the caravan, and visits to check on the health of the two occupiers, both of which were in surprisingly good health considering the living conditions they were in, but still required some proactive efforts in order to look after their health, as living in those conditions had taken its toll on their health through their life. So this is an example of how, with this sort of assistance, the House of Assistance order allows you to do anything you want with the money, but it also says you mustn't fetter your discretion. So sticking solidly to your policy, which you've published, typically updated annually on your webpage, and updated in line with what's required in your area, doesn't mean that you shouldn't deviate from that policy if the case merits it. And in this case, the case most certainly did merit it.